But there are more questions. So the next set of questions is complicated because it all ties together and there's a lot of disagreement or competing theories among historical scholars on this topic. And so let's zoom in and look at this period of the writing before the manuscripts we have. So from Jesus to the actual writing of these Gospels, a couple questions. Who wrote the Gospels? Were they anonymous? When were the Gospels written? Were some of them using others as their source? And was the time too long for accurate memory between Jesus and the writing of the New Testament Gospels? Let's start by looking at the authorship of the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A common objection raised by scholars such as Bart Ehrman against the New Testament Gospels is that they were anonymous for the first 100 years, just floating around and no one knew who wrote them. Therefore, we can't trust them. Actually, the four Gospels authorship does have good evidence linking it to the traditional authors. There's three types of evidence: manuscript evidence, external evidence from other contemporary authors, and internal evidence from the books themselves. For manuscript evidence, all the earliest manuscript copies we have of the Gospels that contain the beginning of each book include a brief title at the top mentioning the traditional author, such as according to Matthew, or the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, or something, according to Mark, according to Luke. In Greek, this word kata would be according to, so euangelion kata markon, or something. And you can see here's some examples from Codex Vaticanus, according to Matthew, or from Sinaiticus, another example, according to Mark. So all the earliest copies that include the beginning have these markings attributing to these authors. Now, secular scholars claim that the earliest manuscripts would not have had that title at the top because those titles would theoretically or presumably only have been added when multiple Gospels were in circulation. That's possible that the books were without any title or tag, but it's just speculation. There's no actual Gospel manuscripts we have which contain the beginning of the Gospels that are missing that title at the top, to my knowledge. If there's any others that I'm missing, let me know and I'll make the correction. But since the manuscript evidence is fairly late, 325, 330 AD, let's move back earlier to look at what we might call the external evidence from other authors at that time who were mentioned, the authors of those books. I'll start with the Gospel of Mark first, but you can see the comments they make about the other Gospels too. Let's start with Origen of Alexandria and move earlier in time. By the way, you'll see that many of these quotes were written down by Eusebius of Caesarea in his writing of the first history of the Christian Church. And he, obviously, as we mentioned, had access to the Theological Library of Caesarea, 30,000 books and scrolls. The largest library in the world at that time was the one at Alexandria, with up to 100,000 scrolls and books. So scholars such as Eusebius from Caesarea, Origen of Alexandria, had access to written sources which probably did not survive until today. Origen wrote that Mark had written a gospel according to the instructions of Jesus' disciple Peter, and he linked this Mark with Peter's helper, as mentioned in 1 Peter 5:13. Next, moving earlier, Tertullian in North Africa around 207 AD attributed the gospel to Mark and mentioned that Mark was Peter's interpreter, so the gospel was essentially Peter's teaching. Moving earlier, Clement of Alexandria wrote a similar account, that Mark wrote an account of Peter's preaching in Rome while Peter was still alive, which would be before 68 AD. By the way, I'm not going to bother to read all these on the video, but you can just pause the video and read them for yourself. And going back to the 2nd century, Irenaeus in Lyon, France, who was the disciple of Polycarp, the disciple of Jesus' disciple John, wrote that Mark was the disciple and interpreter of Peter, and handed on his preaching in written form after Peter's departure or death. Moving even earlier, in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr wrote that it was written in the memoirs of Peter that Jesus changed the names of the two sons of Zebedee to Boanerges. Now, the only New Testament book that records this is the Gospel of Mark in chapter 3, verse 17. So even though Justin did not use Mark's name, he shows us that Mark's gospel was known as the Memoir of Peter. And finally, going back all the way to Papias, who was born in the 1st century, who knew the Apostle John personally, Papias wrote that Mark was Peter's interpreter and wrote an account of what he had heard. So it's very interesting that all the early church fathers who wrote about the author of that gospel attributed it to Mark. Here's a little diagram showing that. There were no alternate ideas for the author of Mark for hundreds of years. The first author to question this was Faustus, writing around 400 AD. Now some people will say that the later authors were all depending on Papias. But this can't be because they all provide slightly different information, especially Justin Martyr, who talks about the memoirs of Peter, the nickname Boanerges, without actually mentioning Mark's name. Also, Irenaeus was discipled by Polycarp, who was discipled by John, so he had separate information available to him beyond Papias. Think also about this. If the gospel had really been anonymous and people just attached Mark's name to it later, why would the church have chosen to attribute it to Mark instead of a more famous apostle like Peter or Paul or James? Later fake works from the 2nd century did try to claim names, famous names like Peter, Philip, Thomas, Mary, but the name Mark was not really famous enough to have been used as a fake name of attribution in the 1st century. So that confirms the fact that Mark did in fact write the gospel. That's why his name is associated with it, because he wrote it. It's also interesting to consider that the church fathers were unanimous about Mark's authorship across geography. Look at where these people are located. Irenaeus in France, Tertullian in North Africa, Clement and Origen in Alexandria, Papias up in Hierapolis, Justin Martyr in Palestine. So they didn't have emails and websites at that time. They couldn't call up their friend with telephone and, oh, where did you get this document? Letters and scrolls of that time were generally carried by known, trusted friends. There were no standard mail service. The only way to find out information separated by long distance was to have someone personally travel there and carry the information with them. So in these high context environments, there was no need for the authors to sign their names in the manuscripts, because the recipients would know by word of mouth who wrote it because it was delivered by hand by a trusted mutual friend. So all these early Christian authors from all over the Roman Empire unanimously affirmed that this gospel was written by Mark. Compare that to some of the other books of the New Testament, like Hebrews, where there was actually several different possible authors mentioned by early Christians, but Mark had only one author associated with it for the first 300 years. And I'm not even listing some of the others, like the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, Diatessaron, the Skeptic, Celsus, Muratorian Canon. There's other documents that also confirm the authorship of the Gospels, but I'm just listing some of the prominent ones here. So the manuscript evidence and the external evidence by other authors confirm that the Gospel of Mark was first written by John Mark, who was a Jewish man who grew up in Jerusalem and was a companion of first Paul and Barnabas and later Peter during Peter's time preaching and teaching in Rome. What about internal evidence from the Gospel of Mark itself? Well, there are more Aramaic terms in a Greek text than usual in Mark, but they're mostly explained if you look at them, as fits an author taking notes from a preacher who grew up in Israel but was speaking to an audience who didn't speak Aramaic. Also, Jewish customs were often explained. I've listed some of the references here. You can look them up, all these different places, or either Aramaic terms or Jewish customs are explained. There's also many Latinisms included in Mark's Gospel. So Latin words transliterated into Greek, and I've listed some of these places. Words for coins and officials, size measurements. This makes sense for a writer in Rome who's writing to a Roman audience. And there's actually a heavy emphasis on Peter and Peter's perspective in Mark, more than some of the other Gospels. Peter is mentioned more often than the other disciples. Peter is also singled out at the beginning and end of the book in what seems to be what's called an inclusio. That's a subtle way that authors at the time would sometimes cite their source of eyewitness information. For example, in Mark 1:16, it says, he saw Simon and Andrew the brother of Simon. It's slightly grammatically awkward, but it serves to emphasize Simon Peter at the beginning of Mark. Then at the very end of the book, it says, go tell his disciples and Peter. It's interesting, of course, because Peter was one of his disciples, but it says, go tell his disciples and Peter. And that seems to be sort of bookending an inclusio that's saying the source of this testimony that Mark is using was, in fact, Peter. In summary, the evidence, including much more that I'm skipping, confirms that Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark, taking notes from Peter's preaching in Rome. And you can look at the supplement if you'd like to find out a lot more information about that. So similar evidence exists to link the authors of Matthew, Luke, and John with their Gospels. from the manuscript titles, early Christian authors' comments, some of which I've listed above, and internal hints. The author of Luke and Acts was obviously the same person from the style similarities. The Greek of Luke and Acts is actually more refined and elegant than the Greek of most of the other books of the New Testament. And the author was obviously traveling with Paul during the events of Acts, as confirmed by the geography that he lists in his travel log and the details of each place that are confirmed by archaeology. We'll probably list some of those details later. John includes a lot of specific eyewitness details from pre-70 AD Jerusalem and from Jesus' ministry. Some say that Matthew and John would not have written about themselves in third person, but other ancient historians at that time did this. For example, Julius Caesar, Xenophon, Thucydides, Josephus, Polybius, and others. You can read more about this in the supplement, where you can find more information corroborating the authorship of these other Gospels. So, in summary, the Gospels were not truly anonymous, as the early church knew unanimously who wrote them.